Thanks very much, and thanks to Matt for not only being with us today and telling us about the ways in which you and your colleagues have been supporting Australian Made, but for the work you do for your union. Thanks to Peter and Glenn for the opportunity to speak today. I think what the pandemic showed us is that we need to make sure we can make things as a country. We need to make sure we can secure supply chains here in Australia. So I support the Made in Australia campaign, the campaign that the union support Aussie Made campaign that the union is engaging in. And what I'd say is this: we have such capacity in this country. We have workers of such capacity. We have skilled workers. We have people who are creative and ingenious. You know what they need? They need a government that will back them. They need a government that will back them. And unfortunately, what we haven't seen from Scott Morrison is a government which is willing to back Australian workers. There is no greater example of this than in the submarine debacle. There's no greater example of this than having $270 billion worth of government procurement not being used to invest in Australian workers, Australian sovereign capability, and to develop supply chains here in Australia. Every step of the way, this government has had to be dragged to bring local content provisions to this contract, because it's not just a legal issue. It is an issue about local jobs, local capability here in South Australia, but also more generally.
Has there been much of a shift in the thinking on this in the last 18 months?
Well, can I just say that Scott Morrison shifted because he had to politically. But I remember Christopher Pyne and Maurice Payne and then Linda Reynolds all telling workers like those standing behind me and union officials like those standing behind me and South Australians, we don't need a local content minimum. We don't need one. Well, now they've decided they do, which was blindingly obvious to everyone. And instead we've had delays and cost blowout. So what workers like Matt and others need is a government that's prepared to back them, and that is what an Albanese Labor government would do. We would back Australian jobs, we would back Australian capability, and we would ensure that we rebuild from this pandemic in a way that secures more supply chains and creates greater sovereign capability.
Most immediately, how can this government come on board?
Well, I tell you what, first this government could actually make Australian jobs and supply chains here in Australia a priority, which when we look at the submarine project, they demonstrably haven't. Can I turn now to the Afghan interpreter issue, if I can? We've seen news today of the tragedy, which is people who helped us in Afghanistan being left behind. Now, Maurice Payne is using this argument that there's a difference between a subcontractor and someone who is employed directly by the Australian government. Well, the Taliban don't care if you worked for the government or for a subcontractor. That doesn't matter to the Taliban. Now, we should do the right thing here. We should do what is morally right. And we should also ensure that we show the world that if you help Australia, we'll help you.
So anybody who's been employed should be covered?
Well, people who are at risk because they worked for our government, whether directly or as a subcontractor, should be looked after. And I remember the minister using fine words when I asked her questions about this. She said, we regard this as a moral obligation. Well, what I'd say to Senator Payne, act like it.
And for those who even are going to get visas, are they moving too slowly?
Well, this has been, if I compare what we are doing in Australia with the swift action taken by our friends and allies, including the United States, we have been slower and we have been less fair. And the cost of that could be in people's lives. These people helped us. They put our lives in danger. We have an obligation to help them. And we also have an obligation to show people around the world, when you help Australia, we help you.